Okay. Lore off. Elves and wizards and all the backstory, we're going to set that aside now. We've gone into the text pretty deeply, particularly Silmarillion, because it helps us understand the Lord of the Rings as you're reading it. What I want to now do is go over Lord of the Rings repeatedly at a number of different levels, thematically. And I want to sort of lay out some elements of Lord of the Rings that I think are really on the forefront of Tolkien's, for lack of a better word, conceptualization of why he's writing the characters the way he's writing them. And then based on that, I want to say something about his concepts of it theologically. Because I think in some of these, he's got more to say than we give him credit for. And some of the things he has to say about heroism, bravery, humility, these kinds of things are profoundly biblical. And because they're told in the form of a story, they kind of wake us up to the things we might have overlooked biblically in terms of the Christian life, I think. When we get to The Hobbit, we are now officially, at least according to the Silmarillion, in the third age of the world. The first two ages having passed. And the third age, you drop right into the world of the hobbits. Now, the reason why the hobbits are not at all discussed in the Silmarillion is because they weren't thought of at that point. Who knows where Tolkien would have put them. But when he wrote The Hobbit, he sort of just creates a little offshoot of the world, sort of up there in the north part of Middle-earth. And the hobbits are the things that become the most attractive thing to people who read the stories. So he then weaves them into the narrative as a whole, though it wasn't conceived of to begin with. Lord of the Rings, therefore, and all of the bringing of these elements from the Silmarillion come after The Hobbit. They come in as a result of the success of The Hobbit. And he creates them from the ground up. I think it's a very, very important thing to notice. From the ground up, he creates these elements and these themes. And he builds this entire sort of new third age move within his world after the success of The Hobbit. Now, everyone has noticed, and it's obvious if you move directly from The Hobbit to Lord of the Rings, there's darker themes. It goes from, even if there are dark elements in The Hobbit, what you get to when you get to Lord of the Rings is a whole new level of darkness, a whole new level of engagement with the problems of corruption and sin and evil. Now, it would be wrong, of course, after everything we've gone through, to say that this is Tolkien just kind of going dark on us, getting moody and kind of gothic. Silmarillion has just as many dark elements. If anything, The Hobbit is the aberration, because it's purposely written as a children's literature piece itself, almost like Alice in Wonderland. And so what ends up happening is there are these darker themes. And it shows that Tolkien was sort of inventing it on the fly, because I know I mentioned this before, but let me reiterate it. If you get a first edition of The Hobbit, the story where Bilbo gets the ring is entirely different from the story as you've known it. In that story, there are riddles in the dark, and Bilbo and Gollum tell these riddles back and forth, and Gollum eventually concedes the ring, and Bilbo takes it and goes, all right, and then Gollum walks him out the door and waves goodbye, and then he goes back in, and that's it. In other words, Gollum is an episodic story in the original Hobbit. He's just sort of there, sort of this interesting creature, and then Bilbo gets this ring that makes him invisible. Tolkien does not seem to have in mind that this ring is some great all-encompassing power yet. He certainly doesn't have any mind that Gollum is corrupted by the ring. Rather, Gollum is just a weird creature down in this cave. And it just sort of fortuitously bumps into Bilbo, and then Bilbo gets the ring, which then helps him beat the dragon. Well, as Tolkien is writing Lord of the Rings, he actually realizes this, and he has to go back and rewrite the chapter, and he does. And so all the editions of The Hobbit you get now have the new chapter with the darker themes of the ring as a corrupting agent, etc. Funny enough, this is actually talked about, again, if you want to talk about an internalist reading of this text, it's actually discussed in the book itself. Why is there a discrepancy? Like Frodo says, I thought Bilbo told me he won the ring. And Gandalf is forced to say, yeah, he was already under the power of the corruption of the ring, and therefore when Bilbo wrote The Hobbit, he lied early on. Which is kind of Tolkien tipping his hat to people that have read the first edition and know that it changed. He's kind of almost playing the game of saying, yes, we now know the real story because the original edition, the first edition was by Bilbo, and he was lying because he was under the power of corruption. And again, you're kind of meant to think this way. But obviously it was Tolkien changing it after the fact, just in terms of Tolkien's history. The situation, though, is that as the Fellowship of the Rings, the first book in Lord of the Rings, develops, again, a charitable reading is that he is increasingly sort of turning down the lights to make it darker themes. He's sort of slowly weaning us into the problem. And he only really sort of drops the hammer at the Council of Elrond when they sort of lay out this history of Sauron and this ring and all the corruption, etc. After that, boom, dark as can be all the way through the end. That's a charitable reading. An uncharitable reading is that Tolkien is fumbling and bumbling his way all the way to the Council of Elrond, that he doesn't quite have a story. Now, most secondary scholars, people who sort of live in the Tolkien world, go with the second option, that Tolkien is kind of not sure where the story is going to go, that he ends up sort of developing this theme. And then when he gets to Elrond's, the council there's all that monologue where they're telling all this backstory. Most people believe that when Tolkien gets there, he kind of lays out the story and he connects it finally to the Silmarillion and he goes, and he has it. And then the rest of the book is very focused, very strong, knows exactly where it's going, and it's weaving in all these Silmarillion elements. That tends to be where I go when I read it. I don't think, obviously I love the Tolkien books, so I don't think, it doesn't pain me to say that about 100, 150 pages of it are a little tough. I mean, my favorite is, that's the One Ring to rule them all. Let's hang out for a year and wait and see what we want to do with it. Like, they just kind of smoke their pipe and hang out. Oh, I better get going. Like, it's the One Ring, stupid. They're looking for you. Go. Like, and there's this sort of this element of what's going on. And I'm sure there's something Tolkien is saying about this, about being measured and planning your steps, these kinds of things. But still, it reads a bit false. Like, well, I don't know. I'm just going to leave it there on the mantle, in case a guy on a black horse comes and asks me where it is. Did I see a hand? Yeah, great question. Did the original edition of The Hobbit have a conceptualization of the ring as being the One Ring? No. There were the conceptualization of the old rings, the Silmarils, as they were called, which is where the Silmarillion gets its name. But Tolkien takes this concept of the ring as a thing that gives invisibility from all kinds of stories in the Middle Ages and in the classic antiquity period. There are all kinds of examples of a ring that gives invisibility. It allows people to sort of get the upper hand on their enemy, these kinds of things. And it's very clear that he just sort of takes that theme and puts it in. I mean, even in the updated new edition of The Hobbit, it's still just a ring that makes him invisible and makes him sneak past the dragon. It doesn't actually... That was the first problem I had the first time I read Lord of the Rings is, how is the thing that makes you invisible that powerful? And of course, the issue is it depends on who's wielding it, kind of a thing, I guess. But in my mind, anyway, the initial impulse of the One Ring is that it's the thing that gives invisibility. Tolkien later, so put it this way, The Hobbit wasn't meant to be an extension of the Silmarillion. It was a standalone volume. When he starts Lord of the Rings, this is why I lectured to the Silmarillion, he goes, I could pull all these backstory themes and write a new story that yet contributes to the full story. And that's what he does.
Did he have to go back into the Silmarillion to invent?
No, the Silmarillion basically doesn't change, as far as we know.
As far as like the chapter of the Rings of Power, did he have to rewrite that, or was that already written?
It was already written. Yeah, the Rings of Power, the last chapter of the Silmarillion was already written, relatively unfinished. It's only like 15 or 20 pages. But he has the concepts all there about this war of the jewels, as it's called. In some ways, the Silmarillion is rejected for publication, and Tolkien goes, okay, I'm still going to do that kind of stuff, but I'm just going to start over. Like, I'm just going to do a rewrite of the story, of the backstory of the lore, and he just includes a bunch of that stuff anyway.
This is the One Ring.
Oh, yeah, the question of the narrator of Lord of the Rings, yeah, because Bilbo wrote Hobbit according to the story. There's some indication that it started by Frodo and then finished by Sam, so it's more Frodo telling the story himself. Most go with that interpretation. It's not quite as clear as The Hobbit and Bilbo, though. Yeah. Though, even then, the narrator bit, It doesn't always ring true that Bilbo wrote The Hobbit either, because there are elements of it where Bilbo's like, oh, what is a hobbit? Let me tell you what they are. It's like, you're a hobbit, Bilbo, so why are you saying they? There's elements of it that are just kind of, let's put it this way, Tolkien has some inconsistency in his storytelling. And people have noted that for years. It just pops up.
Do we know at this point, are they still heavily involved?
Yeah, great question.
In processing in community?
He does. Does Tolkien bring this to the Inklings? Hobbit, of course, yes. He particularly to Lewis. Yes and no. He brings chapters of the Lord of the Rings to the Inklings. There's one sort of painful moment, which again sort of is one of the things that pushes Tolkien a bit out of the Inklings and away from Lewis relationally. As there was one of the Inklings in particular who used to mock Tolkien for these stories. He thought they were stupid and silly. There was one time where Tolkien brought a section of a chapter from Lord of the Rings, and he proposed to read a piece of it, and this one guy laughed and said, "Oh, not hobbits and elves again." Put it away and didn't bring it out ever again. So there was some, with the Inklings as a whole, there was some hesitancy by Tolkien to share, just because it was a hodgepodge group. With Lewis, he shared. He always shared with Lewis, and Lewis would make suggestions. Mostly, Lewis would critique the poetry or the songs as not being the way he would have written them, but Tolkien didn't care. He wrote them anyway. Oh yeah, they are. They're hobbits. Yes, they have a certain greed within them. And the Sackville Baggins is an example. Like the hobbits are just as capable of corruption and sin as any of the other creatures. They're not pure. They have a stoutness of heart and a purity of loyalty, which is actually something Tolkien is going to talk about, which I'll get to the theme here in a second. But the idea that the hobbits are themselves the pristine race is equally, I think, as wrong a path to pursue as to say that the elves themselves are pure always, because the elves themselves do all kinds of boneheaded things. Okay, let me just give you a couple of the four brackets of themes that I'm going to cover. And I'm gonna each one has a bunch of sort of some subheadings as well, so we're gonna go through them. But this is sort of the big picture of the themes that I want to cover in Lord of the Rings as a whole. The first, nature of evil. What is it? What is it not? It's a big question for Tolkien. What is evil? What is its nature? How do we understand it? Whom does it affect? In particular, things like that. The second one I've mentioned on a couple occasions, and we're going to drill down really far into it, the fall of arrogant men and kingdoms. Thirdly, the nature of virtue and heroism. Tolkien does have things to say about being a hero. Being a hero is not just not being a bad guy. It actually means you act positively in certain cases when required. But what is the nature of being a hero? As a fallen creature, that kind of thing. And then fourthly, the nature of restoration. It's something I think is not always touched on. Not many secondary sources go this way with it. Some do. What is the nature of restoration in Tolkien's world? All four of these, now there are others. Now notice what I'm not going after. I'm not going after who is Jesus, who is the Holy Spirit, and who is God the Father. Meaning I'm purposely not trying to give it an overly systematic theology grid. However, each of these themes, I think you'll see, reveals Christ-likeness amongst characters. Whenever someone is being virtuous or heroic in a certain way, particularly a self-sacrificial way, Tolkien is saying this is a Christ-like virtue and humility and self-sacrifice. When an arrogant kingdom falls or arrogant man falls, at times this is what an un-Christ-like method of power is, this kinds of things. And then the nature of evil is both as one corrupting what we naturally are, meaning we're bad, we have sin corrupts that, but also, as I've said a couple times, we're going to drill down into it, the way in which even our good intentions narcissistically make us do bad things. Yeah, the question of why does Tolkien not refer to God explicitly in Lord of the Rings as he does in the Silmarillion? I think there's two tactics there. One is you do have to take Lord of the Rings sort of on its own, because that's how it's published. It's not published with any idea that the Silmarillion will be published. And so we have to take into account that Tolkien is intending not to see the Iluvatar in Lord of the Rings, that we're not supposed to even necessarily know about that. Why is the question. There's really two dominant ideas out there. One is that Tolkien is resisting the idea. He is basically by that point very aware of the ways in which Lewis is writing his books and the fact that they are overtly Christian. And he's resisting a little bit doing too much of that. That's one theory that people have, is that he doesn't want to make this another Narnia series where people start looking for Jesus. Which character is Jesus, particularly. And actually the preface that he writes that's attached to most editions of Lord of the Rings, when he's saying this isn't an allegory and he's kind of banging on that drum, I find when I read that he's really sort of protesting too much. He's sort of saying, no, I don't want, this doesn't have to be allegory, it doesn't have to be Christian theology. It's like, he's only saying that because so many people are. What I see him doing there is resisting sort of the Lewis model in a way. That's one. The second is, and I think there's something to this in a way, all the texts that Tolkien studied, Scandinavian things, the Anglo-Saxon chronicles, have a very curious mix, which is, take Beowulf, for example. Beowulf is not written by a pagan. I don't know if people knew that. Beowulf, the narrator of Beowulf, is a Christian. Beowulf is written by a Christian just after the missionaries have arrived in Scandinavia and begin to proselytize and win converts to Christ. And if you read Beowulf, the tone of it is this Christian who's writing positively of this heritage story of Beowulf, but yet there's also this tone of stupid pagans, this kind of thus go the way of those who do not have Christ. And he kind of highlights both, that you can be proud of it as just as a heritage element, part of the literature of those peoples, but yet also it is the world just before Christ comes in, Beowulf is. Since Beowulf is Tolkien's favorite story, people have said it only makes sense to show that, a lot of these stories in The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings have Beowulf elements in them. That it's almost as if Tolkien's mimicking that he's purposely not talking about, he's using sort of older traditional stories, fairy tales, in a way that mimics Beowulf. Again, you have to kind of triangulate like three different possibilities to land on that conclusion. So a lot of people have said, well, maybe that's what he's doing.
So you're mainly saying that he's doing it so he can not only reach a Christian audience, but also a very secular audience?
I wouldn't say he's doing it evangelistically at all in that sense, necessarily so. Mm-hmm. He does say in the preface, of course I'm writing on Christian themes. He says in his letters too, of course Gandalf is a type of Christ, but so is anybody who's noble and virtuous and these kinds of things. He's just got a peculiar stance on the way literature has to work. And he resists, as I said back in the earliest lecture on The Hobbit, he resists any one-to-one comparison of, this is what the cross is, and therefore the cross is this moment. I've seen goofy ideas like the bridge that they're going across when Gandalf fights the Balrog and falls is cross-shaped. I'm like, no. You get these kinds of things that people, and that's what Tolkien says, stop it. It's just read the story and shut up, kind of a thing. And that's more where Tolkien's coming from. He doesn't want people to do that to his stories. So yeah, I tend to think that he's resisting Lewis's method. And yet he's also just fine with it being Christian themed without being overtly, fully allegorical in the Lewis sense, if that makes sense. Say it, Jake.
Well, the hands of the king and the hands of the hero part.
Yep.
That's pretty over.
Oh, of course. Yeah. But so is Bilbo's pity. So, we're going to get in there. Like the theme, the hands of the king and the hands of the hero. Yes. Gandalf has his elements as well. Sam, believe it or not, has Christ-like elements, this Christ-like devotion. And that's actually where we're going to go as we delve into these themes, absolutely. Sure, yeah, they absolutely were. Plays both. It does. The Inklings wasn't just a double entendre, because it on the one hand, the Inklings mean a lot of these guys wrote with fountain pens and they usually had ink on their hands. But the Inklings were always these people that had inklings of all kinds of, the word I use a lot is kaleidoscope of different things that can come into it. In their mind, good literature always conjures up multiple different sort of reference points on purpose. So this is why the fall of Numenor looks like the flood of Genesis, and yet also looks like the Atlantis story of the island sinking into the sea. Tolkien is very much trying to say, let's make it both. Let's weave in elements so that multiple parts of your brain go, wait, is it this, is it that, or is it this? And what they think is that conjures up a deeper reflection on literature itself. And I think it's true, because I think this is the reason why some of these books haven't died off. I do find, let me put it this way, in one sense, Tolkien's right, because I have met people, I'm not one of them, but I've met people who constantly reread Lord of the Rings. It just constantly becomes like once a year maybe, or something like this. It just becomes just something they love, and they can always reread it and get a second, or a third or fourth every year, keep going back to it and love it. I have yet to find people who are that overtly committed to the Narnia series. I don't know if that's because the Narnia series is so allegorical that you tend to say, all right, I got it, I don't have to read that again. I don't know. It might be just because it's shorter. I'm not going to, slam Lewis. But Tolkien's point, I think, is borne out when you look at how much his books continue to be read over and over again, because he's saying multiple reference points, good literature is just, you keep going back to it, and that has borne out certainly over the 20th and 21st centuries. So far, the 21st century. Okay. These four themes I'm gonna highlight: nature of evil, fall of arrogant men and kingdoms, nature of virtue / heroism, and the nature of restoration. First of all, the nature of evil. For Tolkien, evil is corruption. I wouldn't say he wouldn't also include judicial elements of being guilty, these kinds of things. But the one element that Tolkien is really keen on, Lewis as well, but Tolkien in particular, is the corruptive nature of sin, evil. The way it twists and perverts. The way it takes a good thing and makes it an evil thing. The way it takes a good person and makes him or her an evil person. Evil, I would say for Tolkien as well, is extraordinarily narcissistic. In the sense that it always feeds on what I think of myself, usually when I think of myself too highly. We're going to get into this a little more deeply, but all the elements of, I'm important enough to be able to do this and get away with it, or I'm important enough that I can do this and I'm not as weak as those people who would fall prey to corruption. Example being, just as a counterexample, one of the points of strength. People sometimes don't like this about Gandalf, but when Gandalf is offered the ring, he says, "Don't tempt me. I would be corrupted." There have been people who have been tempted to say, well, that's, of course, they are probably thinking of Gandalf as Jesus, but they tend to say, well, that's not power. I thought he would be strong enough to withstand it. Well, in Tolkien's sense, being strong enough is knowing where you stand in the order of creation and knowing that you are corruptible. It's a humility. The narcissism that evil and sin brings is the belief that I can do this and get away with it. I can do this and it won't actually fully corrupt me. This is obviously a plague in ministry. I can bend the rules and break the rules and sneak by things. Whether it's moral issues or just simply work ethic, whatever it might be, I'm better than all these other people. Therefore, I don't have to live by the standard rules of accountability, whatever it might be. And then unaccountable power ends up always corrupting, either in the worst cases that we've seen or even in benign cases, but it still corrupts. But it always feeds on narcissism. It always feeds on that's not true. You're better than this. Almost in that sense of Genesis 3, of God, are you sure God said that? You're better than that. You could eat of that fruit. Narcissism is the core of it. Evil arises also in Tolkien's world from within and from without. I think this is also profoundly biblical. It arises from within because we're naturally inclined and addicted to sin. We want it. Well, my pastor has a great story. He was a college minister for a long time. And he had one of these, quote, good kids in the youth, or it was high school. He was a high school minister. He had one of these, quote, good kids, the good ones in his group, which you should never put on a pedestal by any means, but nonetheless, and he didn't, but this is one of these sort of upstanding kids. He went off to a secular college and went nuts. Just did everything possible that you can do your freshman year at a state school. And came back, and he had this sort of haunted look on his face, my pastor says, and sat across from him at lunch, and he said something that my pastor's never forgotten, and he uses frequently when he's talking. He says, the student said, "No one told me that sin was fun, all growing up." He says, everyone did basically aversion therapy. Like, oh, sin is gross. We're going to hate that. Like, you don't like that. Ew, yucky. This kind of a thing. Then he tastes it, like actual, the desires of the flesh, you might say, fully. And he goes, nah, that's not bad. I'm going to go for it. And it's that internal desire for it. And that internal desire is always there. It could be there for all kinds of things, but it's always based, you almost might say, like an addiction. Any of you who have done addiction counseling, those of you who have experienced addictions in your life of bigger or lesser significance, will know that the addicted person doesn't want to do it, but always finds themselves doing it. At times convincing themselves that they like it, at times hating themselves while doing it, but always this sort of weird mixture psychologically that feels almost schizophrenic. I kept saying, I'm not going to have another drink, and here I am drunk on the floor. These kinds of things. And other types of addictions as well. So within Tolkien's world, and the way he paints it, addiction does arise from within. It's not always the devil jumping out and making you do things. It's never that in many ways. It's rather that we want these things, that the natural proclivity is always within. So when Frodo begins to sort of succumb to the power of the ring, and then at the end he won't throw it away, he wants it. Now, it's a part of him. It's his desire within. I keep bringing up the movies, but I do think the movies do make the ring too much like a talisman that's forcing people to want it. In Tolkien's world, it's more that they are naturally bent to have idolatrous kind of addictions, and the ring is just a very powerful example of something that you could get addicted to. Possibly, though. But again, the question is that why I made it a simple inanimate object? Possibly, but again, I think that the nature of the ring was always there in The Hobbit. It came in as just sort of this magic invisibility ring, and then he later develops this concept of it being the One Ring and it being corruptible and these kinds of things. But that being said, I mean, no matter how he envisioned it, it was simple. The fact that it is just a simple ring. It's so simplistic, you might even say. It actually sort of, I think, ratchets up the value of the corrupting nature internally to kind of covet this thing. Exactly.
Well, I think your point was proven, and it's not just the ring. I mean, the plants here serve the same function.
Yeah.
So it's just we have a need for items.
Yeah. No, you're right. The Palantir is a great example because it's like, hey, don't touch that. Really? Really? I can't touch it? Like, it's like the immediate, that's what I joke about. As soon as you say I'm going on a diet, you're like, well, there's McDonald's right there. I don't know. Maybe I'll do it tomorrow. This kind of a thing. But no, you're right. It's like the don't touch it element. We always then seek to touch. It always arises within. But it does have an element where it comes from without. I think within evangelicalism, we tend to go one way or the other and deny the other one, right? Strong Protestant evangelicals, those who know Luther on justification and sin, on our corrupt nature and how Christ has died in our place, and we contribute nothing to his sacrifice. Those of us who stand strongly on that always downplay the role of the enemy and act like, all sin is just me forcing, sort of creating these things externally. The fact of the matter is the Bible does talk about the enemy, and it does talk about the world as a corrupting element external to us that we have to be on guard for. That there are always elements outside of us that are tempting us. And just to sort of set Tolkien aside. From a biblical standpoint, it's okay to avoid those things. It's okay to not put yourself in places where those things that are external to us are provoking the internal desires, if that makes sense. I keep going back to this Christianity Today thing, but there was a chart about there's an essay. Would Jesus go to a strip club? I was just like, this is like the medieval, how many angels dance on the head of a pin? It's just one of these questions that it's just designed to provoke a controversy for the sake of controversy. And my response is, whether or not Jesus would is not the question of whether or not we should. First of all, we're talking about a sinless man, and nobody else receives that quality in this life until the resurrection. And so the question of whether or not Jesus would means squat compared to whether or not we should, and these kinds of things. And of course, the question is cultural issues. And again, I'm not going to care that much about the question. But the point, though, is we're always, I think if we stand on this idea that I have been forgiven, like I can put myself in situations where external issues are around me, but I quote, won't be tempted by them, or I won't execute that temptation. The fact of the matter is the world does tell us to be on guard against things. It tells us not to put ourselves in situations where we're next to these temptations, that we might actually reach out for them, metaphorically speaking. Like, in Tolkien's universe, the corruption and the fallenness begins in the angelic realms first. It's the fall of Satan, and then the temptation, etc. And that's certainly biblical. There's elements of that. But the principal point, though, for the scriptures in terms of sin is that it's our rebellion, not a rebellion that we were sort of forced into.
That's what I was going to say. The Bible's very clear that we have sinned not because of fallen angels aside they were going to be bad, but because we...
Well, see, that's the differentiation I'm talking about not to do. Don't say, well, it's not just that we were brought about by corruption from without, it's us. But the way I always say it, I do this in church history classes, the ancient church had a very strong concept of the flesh, the devil, and the world as this sort of triad of the elements that cause and provoke sin. The world is, of course, all the cultural things that are around us. Obviously, we know Satan and the enemy, but there's also a provocation of our sin internally. Now, what I always then ask is, if someone gets addicted to methamphetamine, is it the world that made him do it, the devil that made it do it, or their own sin? Biblically, and I think theologically, you can't parse out, well, the devil made me do it. Well, then if that's the case, then you're immune and it's not your fault. Well, it's just my sin. Well, there is also the culture of drug culture and the temptation of the evil one, all those kinds of things. So in other words, don't parse them. You can distinguish, but don't pretend as if one trumps the other, if that makes sense, in the fullest sense. So if you make sin always external to you, well, then it's not your fault. The devil made me do it. If sin is only my own thing, and and you feel like you've conquered some of the idolatries of your heart, suddenly you're too sort of, as I say, staring at the navel. You're too focused on your own sin, and sometimes ignorant of not putting yourself in tempting situations, if that makes sense. You just think, oh, the world's the world, who cares, it's all benign. Well, Peter says, the devil is a crouching lion, he's roaring, he's there. Just always be on guard. For Tolkien, though, the theme is it's always a bit of both. And how do they compare? Screwtape, you're right. Well, it's funny, to say that Screwtape is kind of an invisible evil is strange, because it's obviously the demon's writing. But the point is, they're writing about how to hide themselves. I think Lewis is much stronger, particularly in the Screwtape letters, at the whisperings and the hiding, the way that the influence of the evil one is hidden in the good things of this world. That it's not just, monsters jumping out of little kids' closets and those kinds of things. For Tolkien, now here's the thing for me as well. I actually think Tolkien is more subtle on sin than people sometimes give him credit for, because you never quite glimpse the evil itself, if that makes sense. All of the evil that you come across is always a corrupted creature. Gollum was some sort of hobbit-like creature that was corrupted down to what he was. Orcs are actually corrupted elves. They actually get that right in the movies. That's why they have pointed ears, and they're of the same height and skinniness of elves. They're just elves who have gone over and totally given themselves up to the evil. what the movie, again, let's keep going out to the movies, but what the movies I think get wrong is Sauron is like shoving his face, his little big flaming eye in everybody throughout the movie, which you don't get in the book very often. You see elements of it. And even, this is something a professor of mine once said when he was talking about it, at the end, when Sauron is vanquished, what happens? Virtually nothing. There's no fireworks, there's no earthquake, it's just, it's like a smoke sort of wisps away. That's it. And it's actually, I think, always been very telling that he doesn't, again, that's one of my criticisms with the recent Hobbit movies. They have to invent big bad guys because they're actually not there in the original stories. The personification of evil is stronger in the movies. Of course, it's a movie. You can't stop and read the book to the people in the movie theater. You have to show them things. And so personifying it, I guess, makes more sense. But in the book, the pronouncement of evil is always at the creature level, which I think is a bit more hidden. But it may be, again, we're comparing Screwtape, which is a different sort of narrative structure than Lord of the Rings. But I do find the same thing. Well, let's go to the Narnia series, because that's what you are reading. I do think Lewis's understanding of the way evil works is similar to the way Lewis and Tolkien differ slightly on their conceptualization of good and God's providence. If in Lewis, Aslan always sort of rushes in and conquers, at least not always, but at least predominantly. Evil is also more of a more potent, obvious force who is sly. I mean, the White Witch is very sly in how she tricks Edmund to eat the Turkish delight. But, you know, it's still very much, Lady in White giving you candy, kid. Like, that is like the epitome of a bad idea. You know, it is more of an assault in that kind of way. So, different shadings, but I always try to remind people that Tolkien doesn't actually glory in the evilness, the evil side of the enemy. Only will he look at the creatures who have themselves become corrupted. Yeah.
And I'm going to teach you for a couple
Yeah.
days.
That's actually a good point. Hey, look, I don't want to have it. You got it, Frodo. You know, I'm gonna go see Sauron. Bye. You know, no, yeah, yeah. Yeah, we won't. Don't unravel. Don't pull at that thread, man. Yeah, Paraland is great on the evil issue because it's the stopping a fall.
Right.
Yeah, exactly.
But I'm not sure if the
Yeah, and I think that's the question Lewis is inviting, is that kind of to put it this way, Paralandra sort of invites the question, or invites us to think. We just take the fall of Adam as a sort of face value. It's like, yep, and then that happened. And it's sort of the question of, it shouldn't have happened. That should always be the first reaction, is this good creation was marred because of it. I think, in other words, I always say evangelicals start too much on in the beginning sin, not in the beginning God created. Sin is a destruction, corruption, fall of the good creation. But we always start with the sin element. Sin is only seen as bad as it should be when it's understood what it corrupted and what shouldn't have happened. And so what Paralandra sort of draws out is this should not have happened. And let me give you a fictional account of a planet that doesn't fall, and that same torturous sort of tension of she's being tempted to fall, and then ransom is sent in to sort of help that not happen, etc. Yeah, and it's always that, and I think it's actually pretty perceptive. Lastly, evil is often usually subtle too as well. Now that's hard to say when you got a big flaming eye on top of a tower and lots of whatever they call it, olifants and evil armies and orcs and Uruk-hai and all these things. It's very hard to see Tolkien as necessarily subtle about sin. But again, this is a great battle scene, great moment of battle. That's fine. He obviously has overt evil. But as we're going to say in a minute, look at the story of Boromir, or the story of some of these other characters who have these subtle temptations, these subtle fallings. Never fully necessarily, but it is more subtle than not. Of course, the great example of corruption in Lord of the Rings is Gollum, Smeagol, who has sort of twisted and perverted himself with the sort of worship of this ring. And of course, it's the most obvious example. In Tolkien's world, Gollum is corrupted. He is almost entirely burnt out of his personality. It's just sort of, he just become this shell of who he was. He has this almost painful long life that he sort of withstands because of the power of the ring over his life. I think, for my money, given when Tolkien is writing it, this is as perceptive and sort of an account of addiction that you can probably find in literature of at least this generation. You have to imagine, this is a world before Betty Ford, AA, lots of comments and just the way we today can talk about addictions in general. We're more clued in terms of our vocabulary of addiction. We know that the people don't want it, but yet they're addicted to it, and therefore they're almost forced in some ways, but they also do want it. That kind of, again, schizophrenic nature of someone who's suffering from a severe addiction. We get this. This language is part of our culture now. I mean, you just have to go back, though, prior to things like Betty Ford or AA groups and all kinds of what we today sort of classify as self-help, as well as Christian addiction counseling. Go back prior to that, though, and you have all kinds of people who thought of addicted people as just kind of idiots. They were stupid for doing what they did. Not that they had some compulsion that had sort of synced up their desires with the external thing and made it this kind of raw addiction that they didn't like, but they also craved in this weird way. Prior to the modern movement of these things, this type of discussion was not very common. Tolkien has it front and center, and I think he depicts Gollum in a way that is as close to a perfect depiction of addiction as possible, in a literary sense. Here is someone who wants that ring so badly he will almost kill himself to get it. In fact, at the end he does. And yet, at the same time, there is this desire it haunts him and he hates it, and yet he loves it at the same time. Those riffs that Tolkien sometimes goes into about how Gollum is addicted to it yet hates it are just very, very, very poignant and profound, really. Because he's doing this before people have really, I mean, if I were to write some hokey story and put this into the character, they'd be like, been there, done that. But the Gollum character, again, I always joke, it's the Citizen Kane of addiction motifs. Of course, Citizen Kane is the movie that sort of changed the way Hollywood does movies, etc. You go back and watch it and you're like, oh, ho-hum, like we've seen all this kind of stuff before. The plot twist ending at the end of Citizen Kane is one great example. Well, it was the first to do it, so you have to go back to remember that no one had done it before. Tolkien's, again, now they were, of course, addicted characters and these kinds of things, but I think the Gollum character is so biblical it's Romans 7. It's this addiction of I don't want to do it, and I'm doing it, and I do it because I don't want all this kind of stuff. And it's I think, very strong. Oh, the isolating of Gollum. Yeah, actually, that's a good point. And it is often commented on. The very first thing that Gollum's sin, his addiction does, one is it doesn't just isolate him first, it actually provokes anger, rage, and murder of Deagle. And what ends up happening is, of course, again, this is Cain Abel stuff. This is very clearly like the sin corruption of I will now slay my brother. But you're right. Tolkien is, I think, on the right path here. At first ostracizes him from his community, his village. And then I love the phraseology he uses. He shakes his fist at the sun and curses the light and goes down into this cave and isolates himself. That kind of stuff is just brilliant. Because he's right. That's exactly what addiction does. Eventually you curse the thing that is like the beauty of creation itself and go into the pit and isolate oneself. Absolutely. Let's see another hand.
I don't know. Dedication to the Lord.
Yeah, the monastic impulse is monasticism leaving the world. A lot of Protestants say that. Historically, it's actually not as true as it's sometimes believed. The monastic movement early on, particularly in the East, Egypt in particular, St. Anthony and others, were isolating themselves. I think they're goofballs. I mean, I did a video on them on YouTube and this whole thing, and just telling the stories of some of these things, you're just like, profoundly weird, in a manner of speaking. The Western impulse, though, which is what was predominantly throughout Europe, very often what would happen is a monastic house would position itself near the city or right out, just on the outskirts of it. And there was this impulse to, quote, withdraw, but the language of withdrawal meant that you sacrificed your career, your life, your livelihood, your money, and you went and served the Lord in ministry. And then the monastic houses would, by and large, turn around and they would be any number of different ministries to that community whenever possible, in the best cases. So they would be hospitals during times of sicknesses. They'd be outreach, giving of bread and alms and these things to the poor. They'd be places for convalescents, all kinds of different things. But by and large, I wouldn't say it's an addiction amongst monastics. It gets really corrupted as the Middle Ages wear on, though. And eventually it becomes we're the spiritual elites. This idea that we're better than, and then it does become sort of strangely idolatrous over time. And then with the coming of the Black Death, 14th century, you get a lot of sort of weird stuff like the self-flagellation movement where you're, whipping yourself to atone for your sins. A lot of goofy stuff like that. But by and large, monks were always in the culture. They were always seen and visible, and the culture went to it. So it was more symbiotic than it's. There were some that moved out in the middle of nowhere, but if you're a monk and you move out in the middle of nowhere and you don't work, you're going to starve to death. So they would always sort of stay near cities to get money and food and things as gifts. But anyway, that to say, there might be some analogies there, but I would say historically not tons of them. No, absolutely. Tolkien leaves that out there. He didn't just leave out there that he is still who he is, Hobbit-like. When he hears his name Smeagol, he reacts in this almost amazing way. And then, of course, he has the rope around him, which is very dehumanizing, and then it's taken off. Tolkien always puts in there this idea that even Smeagol is not too far gone, that he's still somehow a creature. He's still somehow lovable, that even despite the full wickedness of what he's done, he could be treated with the dignity of one of the creatures of God, in that sense. That's not how it's put in the book, but that's how I would put it theologically. Let me just sort of transition that to a modern-day conceptualization. Let's say we're dealing with something in the sex trafficking industry. Why do we want to get people out of the sex trade? Well, on the one hand, because it's dirty and it's gross, and this sort of poor pity them. How could they have got, there's this sense amongst some of the tone that how could they have let themselves get into this world? That's not the biblical reason for getting anyone out of the sex industry. The reason you want them out of the sex industry is because they're the image of God. And images of God do not get treated that way. And that is the fullest example of it. So in this case with Smeagol, just to go back to the story, you don't tie a rope around his neck and use him to get what you want. You take the hit, the potential hit of freeing him, loving him, and at least respecting him in a way, by using his name, and trusting him to hopefully reach out from the addiction. And now, of course, he fails at the end, and he dies as a result. But it was on Gandalf's lips at one point where he says, he may serve a purpose yet, but also, he's not. Basically, the concept of he's not so far gone that we have to treat him like some sort of dirt in that ultimate sense. Very, very, it's sort of a rich reflection on that, actually, I think. Very much so, yeah. So the nature of addiction, and as I've said before, there's a schizophrenic concept within addiction. This again, not wanting it yet wanting it. And it runs the gamut, not just in the full chemical addiction sense, but the addiction to our sins in general. Anger, rage, jealousy, just go down the deadly sins. And all the undeadly sins, though they're all deadly, whatever. And then, as I say here, Gollum actually wants the evil, but yet he doesn't. Don't see Gollum as someone who was out, again, to use that motif, he wasn't corrupted from the outside, he wanted it as well. And then he opened that door, and then the corruption came, and it became this sort of vicious cycle. Very much. Well, if Gollum is a great example of the worst kind of corruption, the story of Boromir and others, but Boromir in particular, is a counterpoint actually to it. I think too often Boromir he gets a bad rap. One, Sean Bean plays him in the movie, and whenever Sean Bean plays anybody, he dies. It just happens. At least that's the joke now. But the story of Boromir, I think, is slightly misread because he's often treated as kind of a golem on the way, like he's easily corruptible, this kind of a thing. And so in other words, when you see Boromir, the character of Boromir, he is corrupted and corrupting, being sort of acted upon by the ring. But it's a different case. The story of Smeagol becoming Gollum and all the sort of torturous addiction that he sort of exhibits, Boromir is a hero that succumbs. And it's hard to realize this because, again, without the Silmarillion backstory, the whole idea of who are these stewards of Gondor and their amazing sons and all this kind of stuff, he's just some guy that shows up at the Council of Elrond in most of your minds, at least the first time you read it. But he's supposed to be one of these he is supposed to be relatively, no, he's not equal with Aragorn or Strider, but he's kind of in that camp. And the movie kind of plays up that they hate each other, which is, I don't think, very strong. Shouldn't have been there, but anyway. But nonetheless, Boromir is supposed to be this like towering figure. He's supposed to not be an easily corruptible guy. He's supposed to not fall. Boromir is heroic. Boromir is worthy, I say here. He is supposed to be one of the leaders that doesn't fall prey to this kind of a thing. And as I've said before, one of Tolkien's more subtle plays is he shows people seeking good even can be corrupted in the seeking of that good. The way they seek it. The example I always use is helicopter parents. They're seeking the good of their kids, but the perfection that they want for their kids becomes the idolatry, and they become these sort of tornadoes of bad parents that just can't leave the kid alone because they've got to be perfect. That's a great example of a good impulse, raising my kids well, becomes the perversion of idolatry, then the narcissism of it. Boromir sort of follows that pattern to a T. He's not supposed to fall. He's supposed to be a hero. He's worthy. And he's seeking good. And what Tolkien really drives here is what I say, the tragedy of failed heroes. Failed heroes is a motif that is somewhat there in literature, particularly in the Middle Ages, but Tolkien really accentuates it. And not just with Boromir, but there's also the choice of Faramir, his brother, to potentially do this exact same thing. And he doesn't. He's very close to doing it, but he doesn't do it. And what Tolkien is really sort of pulling the rug out from under it is that you shouldn't always have such heroes in the world out there. Even the most worthy and honorable and stalwart of the people that we respect can fall. That is an axiomatic principle of ministry. Don't expect anybody to be uncorruptible or unsusceptible to sin, because you will get your head twisted around as soon as you find that one person in the church who is the prayer warrior, the leader, the deacon, the elder, whatever it is, and you find out they're doing something crazy, and you could just go on, goodness, I never thought that would happen. But it always does. It happens in every church from time to time. Because I think, again, to what Tolkien I think is highlighting here, is heroes fall when they're us, when they're sinners. There are no heroes that lack the ability to sin. And it's funny because we get this in the Bible. We get that David could do some really awful stuff like murder a guy and take his wife. We're like, David, man after God's heart. But then we meet people in the church world and we think sanctified, sanctimonious, like perfect person, and we don't ever ask the hard questions about their life if you're discipling them or you're friends with them. You just sort of assume, well, they've got it put together. Well, I think what Tolkien is sort of driving at here, though, is even our heroes can fall. They can be corrupted. All right, next theme. Fall of arrogant men and kingdoms. The fall of arrogant men and kingdoms. I think it goes without saying that power corrupts. The old statement, it comes from Lord Acton. Lord Acton. Power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. It is certainly a theme in Tolkien. But what Tolkien, I think, likes to point out sometimes is the weaknesses of certain institutions, certain structures. The ways kingdoms rise and fall in his realm, in his world rather, are pretty striking. It happens a lot. It happens frequently. In fact, I can't even think of many kingdoms that don't at some point go through fracturing and dividing and near conquering and then come back. Even elvish kingdoms, which are supposed to be pretty doggone good, end up failing. A king becomes corrupted, becomes arrogant, and then the weaknesses sort of come in. And very often what the theme he plays up is, what I say here, is the narcissism that it's my kingdom. That it's not something I'm a steward of. You can see where I'm going. It's not something that I'm obligated to protect for the good of others, but rather this is my kingdom, doggone it, and people need to do what I say. Narcissism of my kingdom. Now, the counterpoint, of course, is what I'm about to say, is he does show the return of Strider or Aragorn's kingdom in Gondor. And he does hold out, again, that there are examples of good leaders, good kings, good rulers, whatever it might be. I mean, the example you mentioned before, it seems like there are rulers at every level. There's a head angelic creature, Manwë. There's a head wizard. Tolkien doesn't avoid leadership. He doesn't avoid headship in some ways, at least in terms of structural components in kingdoms, let's say. He's fine with that. But what he is always very, I think, clear to point out is that the narcissism of it always sort of comes back. And of course, the fall of Gondor to the steward, Denethor, at the end is just really poignant in many ways. Somehow Tolkien weaves in a bunch of complex relational emotions into Denethor that, honestly, I was pretty surprised he does it. The whole weeping over the loss of one son, but clearly doing so for his own sake. Okay, that narcissism of, I'm sad that I lost my son, not I'm sad for my son dying and getting shot with arrows. But more, it's woe is me, then causes him to essentially emotionally abuse his other son to the point of sending him out to die. And then when that happens, again, the woe is me, and then attempting to kill the son and not listening to any good counsel when he's seeking to put him on the pyre and have him burned in a sort of an honored sort of death. Denethor and this whole Gondor story is sort of the height of Tolkien talking about arrogant men, narcissistic kingdoms, etc. And I say here, the treatment of your kin is very, very big for Tolkien. How you treat your own, how you treat those who are not from your biological family, but those who are from the kingdom. Are they things to you, or are they brothers and sisters, you might say, in the Christian world? I think very poignant issue for ministry. If you start to treat the people you're ministering to as objects, numbers, head counts, people that sort of do your bidding, not that anyone ever intends to set out to do it that way, but if you don't see them as co-laborers in the kingdom, as Paul always refers to his disciples, as people that are working with you, then there's always that issue. But the issue with Denethor is the way he treats his own kin is symptomatic of just how corrupted and how arrogant he tends to be. Now, it's subtle. Again, it's subtle enough that, I think the movie shows him as he's just sort of this grumpy old man sitting at the bottom of the stairs when he's eating the tomatoes and there's the juice is squirting out. It just makes kind of makes you a little bit gross. But of course, what is Peter Jackson doing there? He's showing the kind of wantonness of just sort of, he's just gorging himself while his son rides off to battle to die. So there's a reason for it in the movie. But in the books, of course, that's not what's in play. In the books, he's not supposed to, again, it's more subtle. He's not the worst, biggest jerk on the planet. But rather, he is the steward who just, again, the narcissism of how he treats his own kin, his own sons, the way he mourns for Boromir and then treats Faramir like he's nothing, is symptomatic of this narcissism, that he thinks it's his kingdom and he is free to do with it however he wants. But with Denethor, the self-pity of his narcissism, the woe is me, that actually, and this is, I think, an important point for Tolkien, it drives him to deny counsel. Now, again, here's how I'd put it in my own words. No one is telling Denethor to get off the throne and go be a commoner. He's the steward of the kingdom, which means he's effectively the king. No one's telling him to set aside his authority. What Gandalf is holding out to him is, be humble. Listen to my counsel. You're driven mad by your own grief. don't burn your son, idiot. It's kind of, first of all, don't burn your son. Second of all, stop sending your sons off to die. 3, let's get you a nap. Let's calm you down. It's kind of like, no, but there's this idea that because of the narcissism of Denethor, he won't listen to counsel. Oh yeah, absolutely, yeah. You're right to bring up the Rohirrim because they're next. Because I think it's juxtaposed on purpose. There's nothing necessarily corrupting Denethor except his own narcissistic desires. He wants to act this way. There's no one whispering in his ear. But when you go to Rohan, you absolutely have somebody who he is invited in counsel, but the wrong kind. But more on that in a second.
Was it Sauron kind of whispering in Denethor's ear to the Palantir?
Yes, in general, but he goes after that for what reason? The narcissism of his own kingdom. So he opens the door to Sauron, sort of telling him what's going on. But that's a later step. The first step is, well, I'm the steward, so I need to just do what's right. I need to protect this kingdom. And he keeps going, and he goes, and he goes, and he goes. But he is just as corrupted, just as much as the writers of Rohan. But notice what happens when the bad advice is gotten rid of in Rohan. Immediate turnaround. It is more of that kind of external force being pressed upon them. Now, the guy let Wormtongue come and whisper these things in his ears, which he should have done. But Gondor, it's very much, he's pushing it himself. He ends up seeking after this he ends up then seeking Sauron's help as a result. So there's definitely overlap, but the corruption of Denethor is very, very strongly much, I would say, more of it, that internal combustion of the narcissism of what he wants. Rohan, though, I think this scene and these scenes in the movies with Wormtongue and these other things, I think they get these very well. I think they do this right. I do, by the way, also think that Tolkien is taking Wormtongue from Wormwood. I think he's actually using Lewis. This idea of the whispering screw tape in his ear. You can't, one, the name is very, very similar, for one. But two, it plays up many of the similar elements you see in Screwtape Letters that Lewis wrote long before Lord of the Rings. This is one of those rare moments where you see Tolkien doing an homage to Lewis. But the Wormwood idea where he's whispering in the King of Rohan's ear, Theoden. And even, again, this is the movie, but it's not the book, but even the way they depict Theoden as being this kind of almost poisoned old man who, once you get this guy out of his ear and cast him out, returns to health and returns to stability because he was foolish to let Wormtongue in to give him advice. But it was a cracking of the door, not his own perversion, that sort of led him to go and seek after Sauron himself. So Theoden, I would say it's the corruption of bad counsel. The corruption of knowing, I always say one of the biggest challenges in leadership, in ministry, and all kinds, is knowing who to listen to. Too often we listen to the people that are the richest, the most powerful, and the strongest in our congregations or in our ministries. I'm not casting aspersions. I'll make this a multi-denominational comment. But I defy most churches to point out to me whether or not the elders or the leaders, the deacons, or whatever you call them in your church, are not typically the bankers, the lawyers, the big dogs, the suit-wearing, like, big, strong voices in the church and the money. Now, not entirely, but why is it we gravitate to their advice always? Now, businessmen, lawyers, and them are not evil people by default. They're godly men in all those professions. I'm not saying that. But wrestling with this with a pastor that I'm talking with, I'm saying, why is it that he has, a bunch of businessmen running his board, and they're dealing with theological issues right now about how to shape the vision and the mission of the church. And he was complaining that the businessmen want to make the mission and the thing core values that look very business-like. And he's saying, no, we need some theology here. And he goes, I just don't have enough theology. And I said, yeah, but I'm sure there's somebody in your church that does. Why don't you go ask them to help you with that? Why is it you only have one channel of communication and advice? I said, just as you would be stupid if you were looking at a blueprint for a new building to not ask them what they think, or a contract or something, because that's their skill set. If you got people in your church that are gifted in negotiating conversations of spiritual things, of biblical fidelity, of theology, etc., why are you not asking? I don't care how much money they have. They can be poor people. Just ask it. Just go to the people who have the skill set. But the way, I think the concept of theoden, this theme here of we close our ears to certain channels of advice because we don't think they're good enough, sufficient enough. We have animosity towards them, personal friction. We close that door and we only seek advice in certain channels. Maybe someone who's got power, maybe someone who's got money, maybe someone who we want to impress, so we like to ask them what they think. These kinds of things. We close our ears to those advice channels, and we open them to the wrong ones. This is a profound thing, and I think this is very much the case in Theoden, that what he wants is to have advice, and then he opens it up to the wrong person. And it becomes corrosive as a result. Last thing to say. The fall of arrogant kingdoms, of course, has a counterpoint in Aragon and the restoration of Gondor. At no point does Aragon exhibit the corruptive, corrosive, bad judgment, not listening to advice themes that you see in the other bad kings. He listens to hobbits when they have ideas. These little halflings that people wanted to sort of strap to their back and not care about. He seeks advice from the strong and the weak. He just needs the proper advice. He's a good leader. He's a strong leader. He's unwavered. All the things that you see in Aragon. And therefore, at the end, with the restoration of Aragon and his coronation as the returned king of Gondor, it's supposed to be, finally, the king has returned. We now will live under the rule of someone who will not be subject to these stupid whims of corruption and narcissism. Which I think, as I say here, Aragon he has a strength of purpose and he's self-sacrificial. And I think Aragon is underappreciated for being Christ-like throughout the books. The coming of the king, the restoration of the king, the king in exile who needs to restore. These are clearly Christological messianic themes. I think the problem is evangelicals have mostly only talk about conversion and not about kingdom. But what was Christ's first sermon? The kingdom is at hand. Then repent and believe. It doesn't start with conversion and then go, hey, by the way, I'm a king too. The kingdom is at hand. I am now the king, or I am the king, and now follow me. Yeah. Very, very much. Yeah. Great way to put it. Denethor is corrupted by his own desires, his own narcissism, so he then eventually throws himself into the arms of Sauron. Theoden is trying to be strong, and again, once the poison of Wormtongue is gone, he returns to being the great leader that he should have been. But he opens the wrong doors and these kinds of things. So he's not a bozo, but he does misstep. You're right. That's the counterpoint that I'm suggesting. With Aragon, he has a strength of purpose that will allow him to. He wants Sauron cast down. He doesn't care if it's from a hobbit or from Gandalf. He's not, shut up, hobbits, I'm talking to a wizard now. He rather seeks the good of the entire group throughout the entire journey. Also, you're right. That's what I'm going to say in a later lecture on what is good strength. It's humility. It's not seeking one's own narcissistic authority and the aggregation of power. It's knowing that Aragon knows he has it, but he also knows that it's not his, that it was his by birth, and that he is a steward of it, and that he could easily corrupt himself or be misled by bad counsel.
I also like that he embodies
Yeah, that's actually one of my favorite scenes when Aragon meets Sauron face to face. He's just like, he's not shaken by him, not out of arrogance, but he knows it's his job to stand up at that point as the sort of head of the people, as the figurehead.